just a few to suggest. If you don't know any on your own, there's the International Rescue Committee. Of course, there's UNICEF, Doctors Without Borders, and also the International Committee of the Red Cross. And when I finish speaking here, I'm going to put those organizations and their websites in the chat. The second thing is we want to encourage you to please continue to attend our meetings. Like Mike said, we hope to be in person soon. We're searching and trying to figure out how that can be done before the library accepts groups back into their meeting room. And in the months to come, in fact, next month in April, we are going to have Robert Birch, who is the president of the Washington U Young Democrats Club. And we're hoping he can give us a rundown of what the students are doing to prepare for the elections this year, some of their activities, and even hopefully some ways that we can all work together if they'll talk to most of us older types who come to some of these meetings, but we hope that they will. And then in the months to come, we'll have some candidate forums for representative candidates, as well as for U.S. Senate. We'll have a candidate forum. So stay tuned and watch for our announcements. And lastly, just really quickly, if you have not yet upped your membership or renewed your membership for 2022, you can go to our website, which is www.chesterfielddemocrats.org. And there's a membership tab. We'd really appreciate your renewing, because that's our sole source of income for our contributions to local candidates as well as to local progressive causes. So just want to encourage you to do that if you have not already, or if perhaps you're not one of our members already, we encourage you to join. So thank you, and I'll give it back to Mike, who'll be introducing our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. As I said, I'm not one to just read bios. I feel the speakers do a much better job introducing themselves. So I'm going to turn it over now to Deb Lavender, who's running for House District 98.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for the opportunity to be with all of you tonight. I know a lot of you. I'm Deb Lavender. I did serve as state representative for 3 terms, 6 years. And you all know we lost a hardship in 2020 for the Senate. And unfortunately, there wasn't much else we could do about it. So I've been asked, and I have agreed to run for state representative in the new District 98. It is currently most of where Trish is. And then you all know that Trish has chosen to run against Ann Wagner. So we're thrilled for the opportunity she's moving on to, and she has left most of her seat. And I say most, it's a little bit of the district that Shamed has right now. And she's leaving that open, and I have filed to run for office 2 weeks ago. So we're excited about that. We're putting our team together. We're putting all of the things together that we need to do to win this race. Phone calls, canvassing, and then of course I'm doing some call time already to raise the money that we need to have to run a successful campaign. So with that, we'll be using the information I have on the budget is kind of the guide to how we're going to be presenting the topics. Education, healthcare are certainly very important for all of us to know about, but tying that into the budget and how we have today $11 billion sitting in the bank, and that there's no reason why that's not out in the communities helping. So those are going to be how we steer some of the conversations about the money. It is not fiscally conservative to leave $11 billion in the bank when there is so much need in our state. So that's going to give you a sense of the topics and how we're going to be running some of this campaign. Certainly, we plan on knocking on doors. We're going to have a kickoff canvassing on April 23rd. We'll get an invitation out to most of you for that. Hope that you're able to join us sometime between now and November to knock on doors. Thanks for having me. I'm available. Hopefully you know how to find me. If you don't, Google Deb Lavender, I'll pop up. I have my phone number out all over the place. You're always welcome to give me a call. Thank you for all you're doing. Thanks for coming on tonight to listen to us this evening, present what we're up to. And I look forward to seeing you soon on the trail. Thank you.
Thank you, and good luck in your campaign. And with that, I'm going to give it to Mr. Keeney now for his introduction.
Hey folks, how you doing? Thank you to Chesterfield Township Democrats for inviting me to speak tonight. I really very much appreciate it. Campaign season is starting now. I'm John Keeney. I'm running for state representative in Missouri's 88th House District, which includes Eureka, Crescent, Allenton, and Sherman, as well as parts of Pacific, Fenton, Baldwin, and Ellisville. It kind of looks like a Rorschach test kind of thing. It's kind of artsy. I'm a fifth-generation Missouri native that was born and raised in St. Charles, Missouri, spent 10 years in Boston, Massachusetts, returned to the St. Louis area in 2001, and now live in Eureka with my wife, Michelle, and our 2 little children. I've worked as a professional musician for 35 years, in case you didn't know, but I've also spent the last 15 years raising, supporting, and advocating for victims of domestic violence and neglect. As a foster provider, advocate, legal guardian, and an adoptive parent. My motivation for entering the political realm was as a means to address the challenges that my family has faced regarding government agencies, healthcare providers, social work agencies, skilled nursing and behavioral facilities, and protecting and nurturing victims of domestic violence and neglect. As a Democratic candidate for the Missouri House, I'm running for office so that I can fight for my family and fight for your family in Missouri's Republican-dominated General Assembly. I believe in and strongly support democratic values, such as making healthcare affordable and available to every single U.S. citizen, creating jobs that pay a living wage or better, supporting the small businesses that make up 99% of the businesses in Missouri, defending women's reproductive rights and making sure that they have access to reproductive care, ensuring justice and equality to minorities, LGBTQ individuals, the elderly, the disabled, and the infirm, defending the right to vote and the ballot initiative, defending workers' rights and the right to organize and collectively bargain, supporting, defending, and fully funding our schools and educators, committing to revitalizing our rural and urban areas, and in a nutshell, putting the welfare of the people over profit. This is my 3rd attempt. I know Deb did 4 before she won. This is my 3rd attempt running for a state legislative seat, and by far the best chance we've had so far. Redistricting has raised our DPI quite a bit. We're up in the 40s now for a D on the ballot, hypothetically, and Dottie Bailey, Representative Dottie Bailey, stepped down, so we now have an open seat, 2 Republican challengers who were unknowns. That's going to help. Unfortunately, we're once again we're lacking Democratic candidates in a lot of the House districts around my district. So one of my asks tonight is, if you do not have a Democrat running in your state House district, would you consider adopting my race? And of course, Deb and I know Colin Lovett, a few other people, but I'm speaking for myself. Would you consider adopting my race as your own? You can find me online at www.johnkeeney.com. You can find me on social media, John Keeney for Mo, at John Keeney for Mo. You can email it info@johnkeeney.com. And you can call me if you want to, 636-324-3570. Now, our kickoff event is going to be Saturday, March the 26th at the American Legion Hall in Eureka, 333 Bald Hill Road in Eureka, 63025. We start at 7 p.m. To get more info, to join our host committee, and to RSVP, go to KeeneyKickoff2022.com. Once again, thank you to the Chesterfield Democrats for doing what you do, for inviting me to come on, for inviting us to come on, and for supporting Democratic candidates and Democratic values in West County and beyond. Have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank you, John. And John brings up an interesting point that there are a lot of districts that do not have Democratic candidates yet. So if you ever thought about joining public service, this might be an opportunity. If your district doesn't have a candidate, I would encourage you to seriously think about if you could fulfill that need. Let's move on to our featured speaker tonight. Dr. Anita Mannion is an assistant professor of political science at the University of Missouri. She's also a political analyst for KSDK, and she's going to talk to us tonight about current issues in state and national politics. And with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Mannion so she can introduce herself and educate us tonight. Dr. Mannion?
Hi, I'm glad to be here with you all tonight. I don't think I need to go into an elaborate introduction, but as Michael said, I teach at UMSL. I teach courses like American politics, public policy, gender and politics, politics of poverty and welfare. I am the political analyst for Channel 5 and do work with other media outlets. And my research looks at issues of equity with concerning policy implementation, particularly in the areas of education and elections. So that's enough about me. My plan for tonight is to just talk about a variety of current issues in politics, both at the state and national level, and give a very informal presentation and then leave lots of time for Q&A at the end. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. I do have some slides for us to look at. So hopefully everyone can see this. So some of the themes that I'm going to talk about tonight are census and redistricting. I know some of the candidates have referred to their new districts tonight. Talk about looking ahead to the midterm elections. It was also pointed out that this is an election year. And then a little bit of honing in on those topics and other Missouri political topics. So I'm just going to step back for a second and talk about the census, because that's what brings us to where we are in the redistricting process. I probably don't have to tell this group how important it is to complete your census, but I try to remind everyone of that. So if you look at this map, you can see the change in population from 2010 to 2020. And we're, I guess, fortunate in Missouri in the fact that we're not in that sort of peaches color like Illinois. We didn't lose population, but we barely gained population. You can see some of those areas that got 10% or more in the Sun Belt there and on the west. And then this map shows the congressional changes by state after the 2020 census. So the states that are in yellow gained seats, and the states that are in dark gray lost seats after the census. So in Missouri, we lost seats in after 2010, but we maintained our seats this year. You've probably seen the headlines that one of the takeaways from this census was the percentage of the population that identifies as white has fallen below 60%, and the growth largely happening with the Hispanic population. Now, this has been an area for the Democratic Party where they've thought for a long time, like demography is destiny, and as the country becomes less white and the people of color, those populations grow, that's only a good thing for the Democrats. But I think there are a lot of assumptions inherent out there about how the Hispanic population might vote. That is not a monolith. There are lots of different people there from lots of different countries and backgrounds. And Trump proved to do a lot better with the Hispanic vote than people thought that he would. With this latest census, Missouri fell to the 19th largest state. And for the first time, St. Louis is no longer one of the top 20 metro areas. And Illinois fell to the 6th largest state. So all of that sets us up for our redistricting process. So for the congressional level, a lot of people were sort of sky is falling for the Democrats as of a couple months ago. And I don't think that's going to be so true. One reason is because the Republican Party made such gains at the congressional level and House redistricting in 2010, frankly, there's not that much further for them to go at this point. Also, in some of the Democratic states, they have responded with a more aggressive redistricting approach. So states like New York and others have sort of been more assertive and taking sort of a note from the GOP playbook there. And we're seeing different maps being challenged in courts and thrown out. Just yesterday, the Supreme Court refused requests from Republicans in North Carolina and Pennsylvania to overturn their maps. However, they had allowed the Alabama map to remain in place. So gerrymandering is not new. This picture here is of our sort of first thought of gerrymandering, and that goes back to the 1800s. But the issue here, why we talk about it so much in more recent years, is back then they didn't have the technology. And as one of the courts said, the surgical precision to literally cut block by block and select the voters instead of the voters picking their politicians. So in 2010, the GOP got a net of 16 to 17 seats in the House of Representatives that it would not otherwise hold. So with their really aggressive approach to gerrymandering in 2010, it paid off for them. Also, we're on pace to have fewer than 40 seats that are considered competitive in the US House of Representatives. 10 years ago, that was 73. So one of the outcomes of gerrymandering is often these safe districts, which means that candidates can be much more extreme on both ends of the poll, and that the primary race is where all the action is. And so primary candidates try to outdo each other rather than sort of coming to the center in a general election. And another example in that should say 2010, I apologize, there were only 12 competitive districts in Texas. Now, after the redistricting process, there's only one. So while gerrymandering is not new, it is much more impactful these days. And you probably have a sense of the different ways that districts and states can be gerrymandered, but you can have situations where there is not appropriate representation, and that's done in different ways. The primary ones would be cracking. So we split groups of people with similar characteristics across multiple districts. And that's why when we hear the Republicans talk about that 7-1 map, this cracking would be their approach in the Kansas City area to sort of take that district and crack it and tie it in with other districts. That's also the reason why some Republicans are hesitant to do that, because then you could have those Democrats from Kansas City bleeding over into some of those Republican districts. But that's one strategy, is to crack a district. And the other, of course, is to pack it, to cram all of, for example, the Democratic voters into one district and then say, fine, you can have these two districts in St. Louis and Kansas City, and we will take all of the rest of them. So, like I said, Democrats have drawn these pretty aggressive maps in Illinois and New York. And there are some projections that we've seen by Cook Political Report that it's possible, based on the redistricting, that Democrats could gain 2 to 3 seats. However, overall, in a midterm election year and with Biden's approval ratings really low, I would brace yourself that the Republican Party could flip quite a few seats in the House. But this isn't just about this one midterm election in 2022. Redistricting matters for congressional power for the next decade. So this is a really important process. So currently, with the new maps, and I will show you, there's only 4 states that haven't really completed their maps so far, Missouri being one of them. So this is what the current status of redistricting looks like. And you can see lots of red out there with those concentrated solid Democratic areas. And then with those maps that are currently drawn, there are 181 Democratic leaning seats based on former congressional races, 177 Republican leaning seats, and 33 highly competitive seats, with 4 states left to go. So that if you just look at those numbers there, 181, 177, that doesn't look too bad, but wait until you get, some of those remaining states in there, and those highly competitive seats in a midterm election year with an unpopular president could be more challenging than those numbers look. Another way to look at it for the current districts that have been drawn, which is almost all of them, is how those districts voted for either Biden or Trump. So if you look at districts that voted strongly for Biden in 2020, you're gaining 1 seat in those districts at this point. For strong Trump districts, you're gaining 16. Lean Biden, you're gaining 13, and lean Trump, you're losing 12. But then, I also tend to go back to that middle, is you're losing a lot of those close districts as well. So fewer competitive districts. In Gallup's polling history, presidents with a job approval ratings below 50% have seen their party lose 37 House seats on average in the midterm. So we know there's sort of that historic backlash to the party in power in the midterm elections. If the president's ratings are above 50%, the average loss is more like 14 seats. Well, of course, we know Biden's ratings are below that 50% mark. Certainly things can happen between now and November, but with the way gas prices and other things are going, I wouldn't expect him to get past that threshold. With Trump's approval ratings in the low 40s, the Republicans lost 40 seats in 2018. And in Obama's first midterm election, the Democrats lost 63 seats. So just a preview of what we could see for the House elections. When we look at Missouri's congressional districts, which, as you know, we have 8, Missouri has 6 Republican and 2 Democratic seats. But you can see here the vote share in the presidential election. So this is part of gerrymandering and part of people sorting themselves into certain areas. But certainly our representation in the state is not proportional by party. And again, Missouri population growth was 2.8%, which is way under the national growth. And I know this is something that a lot of Missourians and St. Louisans are working on and care about. Immigration has been a good growth area for us. I know many are working on resettlement of Afghan refugees. And, we're looking at other ways to grow our region. To kind of highlight that, when you look at District 1, so if Cori Bush is your representative, it was among the top 10 nationally in population decline since the last census. So the decline went from 748,000 in 2010 to 714,000 in 2020. So this isn't the top 10 that you want to be in. That district was drawn in the 1960s intentionally to be a majority African-American district, and currently is the only district in Missouri with a plurality of Black voters. Now, because of that population loss, certainly the first district will be redrawn, is being redrawn, and it will expand into the suburbs. The district that's really being looked at in Missouri congressional redistricting would also include the 5th district. So that's represented by Emanuel Cleaver, and this in the Kansas City area. The 1st and 8th districts are both more than 40,000 people short of the required population. So they will have to include more residents in the new maps. The 3rd district, which is largely St. Charles and wants to be totally St. Charles, saw the biggest growth in the state. So they went from 748,000 to 804,000. The 2nd district, those of us who have Ann Wagner as our representative, hasn't sent a Democrat to Congress since 1990, but Wagner certainly faced some strong challenges in 2018 and 2020. And so they will try to draw that map so it goes more into Jefferson County and more solidly Republican areas to make that less competitive, even though it has been held by Republicans for decades. So the congressional maps are drawn by the Missouri legislature. The state legislative districts are drawn by these committees, which we'll talk more about. We actually had success, though, by one of the commissions this year, which is very unusual. So when we look at gerrymandering, again, Missouri presidential voting in 2020, Trump 57%, Biden 41%. But when we look at that congressional representation, it's 75% GOP and 25% Democrats. So certainly not proportionate. This is the congressional map, the Shaw map, the 6-2 map that has been, or the Nancy Pelosi map, if you prefer to call it that has been proposed and passed by the House. But of course, the Missouri State Senate has not taken this up. There's definitely a lot of infighting among the Republicans there. And, we'll wait and see, but I can't see any way that a 7-1 map passes. I think we all feel pretty confident it will be a 6-2 map, but the question is, when will that be taken up and where might there be some slight changes? When we look at this nationally, so Missouri has had some back and forth about how we should draw maps, and nationally, all of the red states, Republicans control the redistricting process. You have to give them credit. They were savvy and made this a goal, and so largely got these gains back for the 2010 census. In the blue states, Democrats control the redistricting process, so less than half as many districts. In the pink states, you have split government, so both parties are controlling that. And then in the yellow states, they have independent commissions. So that is definitely an increasing trend. And we do see more competitive seats in many of those states that have the independent commissions. So even though there's so many states back here that are red, and there's 187 districts that are controlled by Republicans in redistricting, you can also see, and this is for Congress, you can also see here that while one state since the last census the Republicans have gained control in, the number of districts that they're drawing actually has declined as more states opt into that yellow line of independent commissions. So I guess I'm showing you this to first highlight the different ways that districts are drawn. Also to show that, yes, certainly Republicans have the lead in this, but thirdly, that these independent commissions are gaining traction and are a viable way forward and are cutting into some of the control that the Republicans have in this process. So that's maybe for a Democratic group a little bit of good news, but I'm showing you some data that probably affirms what you already felt in your heart here, that the House of Representatives has had a Republican bias since at least 1968. So you can see this graph shows you like Republican +2, Republican +4, so how much that bias is, with it really being high in recent years. So these are times also in which the Democrats won the House popular vote, but Republicans still control majorities in the House. So this is a barrier that the Democratic Party has to overcome in order to get control of the House. Something else to think about when it comes to the House, these are retiring House members this year. So in Missouri, there's two. They're both not seeking re-election because they're running for Senate. Long and Hartzler, but otherwise they're kind of spread out throughout the country. And this graph maybe shows a little bit more what's happening. So these are retiring House members by party and by year. And you can see often in years where candidates don't think their party is going to do as well, that's a time they might choose to retire. And so you can see here that in 2022, the retirements are much lower for the Republicans than the Democrats, where the opposite was true in 2020. So those retirements, of course, represent open seats. And if your party was already in control of that seat, that means you're losing an incumbent and having an open election. So that can put you at a slight disadvantage from where you would have been. So that's the House. And now this is the Senate. So this is where the Republicans are defending Senate seats. A dark red means that's vulnerable. Maybe the Democrats could tip that seat in this midterm election. But the lighter red, like Missouri, is likely uncompetitive. We'll talk more about the Missouri Senate race, but I think likely uncompetitive is a fair characterization, depending on who the nominee is for the Republican Party. And this is that same map, but for the Democrats. So you can see that there are 3 vulnerable Democratic seats here, possibly competitive seat, and then overall unlikely competitive Democratic seats. So a fairly close race here in a Senate that is already tied 50-50. So if I were a betting person, and I don't like to bet or make predictions, but I would say that Democrats have a better chance in the Senate than the House in this midterm election. Again, looking at that same bias, you can see that over time, the Senate also has that Republican bias or advantage. So that can mean, as you're probably familiar with, because every state gets 2 senators regardless of population, and the more rural, less populated states are generally controlled by Republicans, Republicans have a 5-point advantage in 2020 which means they can win a majority of those seats, even though they don't represent a majority of the population. Now, this map shows, based on the census redistricting, so the reapportionment of those House seats, that also affects the Electoral College votes. So this is an Electoral College map based on the 2020 census results. What it would mean is the Republicans, if all the states voted the same, Republicans would gain 3 votes in the Electoral College and Democrats would lose 3. So and you can see the states, how that would happen. Now, on the left side, I put the 2020 Electoral College vote, which was the Democrats had 306 and the Republicans had 232. So this wouldn't change those presidential election votes, but it just makes it even more challenging for the Democratic Party. And, it's interesting that we talk so much about the bias in the Electoral College towards Republicans, and there's good reason for that when we look at the fact that consistently in recent years, Republicans are not winning a majority of the popular vote, but have won the presidency. So some of that sparks these conversations. But really, the bias is even more pronounced in Congress, but it does exist here in the Electoral College. But there's some years that Democrats have had an advantage as well. Maybe if some folks saw this, that would convince them to support Electoral College reform, but I digress. Okay, so that's sort of looking at it from the national level. Missouri, I think we can count this as a big victory, no matter what political party you were affiliated with. We did something bipartisan. We came to agreement, and the commission passed the House map. So this is for the state House. And that is notable. It's notable not just because we have more competitive seats, and we'll talk about that, but it's the first time since 1966 that the map was unanimous, and the first time in decades that the commission has drawn the map. Because usually the commission deadlocks, and drawing these maps is sent to courts, which is what will happen with the Missouri Senate map. But the state House, what do you know? We actually got the map drawn. So that's pretty exciting. In the new map, in 38 districts, Democrats should have the advantage. There should be 97 where Republicans have the advantage, and 28 competitive districts. So I think that that is exciting. It's a possibility that the Republicans will not have a super majority in the state House anymore. Under the new map, there's 16 districts that are majority Black, and 1 in the Kansas City area that is more than 40% Hispanic. Currently, there's only 11 districts with a majority Black district and no districts with a Hispanic population that are large. So that's a win for racial and ethnic representation. Currently, in the House, there was 108 Republicans, 49 Democrats, and 6 vacancies. So you can see that if there's 38 districts where Democrats have the advantage and 28 competitive districts, there is a real opportunity under this new map for Democrats to make gains in the Missouri legislature. Now, again, for that Senate map, it is gone to a panel of judges, and they have until April 23rd to file their claim. Another topic that I feel like we've been talking about nonstop for a long time here is the Missouri Senate race. So ever since Roy Blunt announced that he would not seek re-election, there's been what I think is fair to say a fairly contentious primary race on the Republican side. Some candidates who are, let's just say, unconventional for now. And the leaders in this, really based on fundraising and polling, seem to be Eric Greitens, Eric Schmidt, and Vicky Hartzler. But you certainly you can't rule out Billy Long. I think you can rule out Mark McCloskey. Now, for Democrats, they're really hoping that Eric Greitens gets that nomination. I think the best opportunity that the Democrats have, seeing how Republicans and Democrats have performed in statewide races in the last couple cycles, is that Eric Greitens gets that nomination. And then, you have a candidate that even Vicky Hartzler says she would not support if he were the nominee. Then I would say these are the two front runners on the Democratic side. So Coons has been a leader in fundraising, even as compared to Republicans in the state. So as of December 31st, he had fundraised more than $2.48 million, and Eric Schmidt had raised 2.44. He was second. I put the numbers for some of the other candidates there. But when it comes to Democrats, Coons is leading by far in fundraising and also cash on hand. He has about $809,000 cash on hand for the last reporting. And Scott Sifton, who I would consider the other main candidate for the Democratic nomination, had about $156,000 on hands. He had raised about $890,000, so far behind Coons on the fundraising. Coons has really been able to get national attention and to make a name for himself, framing himself as a populist, almost like, in the term, it's interesting, and we can talk more about this, how both Democrats and Republicans have tried to take this populist banner in a number of ways. But so far, Coons seems to be doing well with it. A poll from January found that Greitens, when matched up by name, Greitens and Coons, Greitens is just right outside the margin of error when facing up to Coons, which I'm sure is one of the big reasons that many Republicans are nervous about Eric Greitens, who has been leading in the polls. And about 19%, almost 20% said they would be undecided in that situation. As you have probably heard, there is Danforth has really been talking a lot about looking for a centrist Republican to run an independent race for Senate this year. He's expressed his distaste for Josh Hawley and regret about supporting him. And also, I think, just looks at this field of candidates and is very concerned. And so, do I think that an independent candidate is going to win the Missouri Senate race? No. Do I doubt that there's even time to get one and get that person the ballot and have a legitimate campaign? It's really cutting it close. But they say their polling indicates a generic Republican nominee that's aligned with Trump polls about 31% in the state. In that same question, a generic Democratic nominee aligned with Schumer polled at about 31%. And a Republican leaning independent was polling at about 28%. So Danforth sees that as hope to move forward. And also says, when the names of current candidates were used, again, the independent polls strongly. Missouri has not elected an independent to Senate since we started actually electing senators in 1913. Of course, there are two members of the Senate currently who are independents. They both caucus with the Democrats. That's how the Democrats have 50. Now, having said all that I don't think an independent is going to win the race, again, from a Democratic perspective, the ideal situation is Greitens gets the nomination and Danforth runs an independent. And that way you kind of split that vote. You get the people who are really turned off by Greitens, maybe voting for this independent, and you get a popular, candidate like Coons in there, and maybe he has a chance, sort of a Jason Kander maybe candidate. This is polling that was done in July of 2021, but done repeatedly in June 2020, October 2020, and July 2021 by SLU and YouGov, looking at what are the top priorities for Missourians when it comes to their state government. And consistently, the economy is number one. With inflation and gas prices, I think that we're hearing a lot about that at the national level, and I think that's going to trickle into our state politics as well. Healthcare being number two, which is interesting. You think the Democrats could really capitalize on Medicaid expansion and some of the other issues with healthcare there, followed by education, infrastructure, and others. Another concern for Democrats in Missouri, but also nationally, is this urban-rural political divide. So this is looking at presidential elections and the point lead by geographic area. So you can see that bottom gray line of, yes, maybe the Democrats were not above water in rural areas prior to 2016, But boy, that line started going down in 2008 and it has tanked in 2016 and 2020. When we look at those maps and there's all those red areas with the blue population centers popping up, this is what we're seeing. And yes, the Democrats have grown their voting base in the large metro areas, largely, due to Trump, but he was an accelerant there, I think it's fair to say. But I think this is something that the Democratic Party really has to be thinking about, is those rural areas. And as we're seeing redistricting in Missouri and rural and suburban areas tied together in some of these new districts, it's important to think about this. A little bit of data: in 2016, Clinton won 45% of suburban voters. In 2020, Biden won 54%. But I don't know if you can count on that when you're not opposing Trump. In 2016, Trump won 59% of rural voters, and in 2020, he won 65%. So this is the needle that I think Democrats are trying to thread. How do you expand your coalition of voters to grab those independents, to grab rural voters, but also to get enthusiasm among the base and to make sure you have that voter turnout? I think Biden was trying to thread this needle in his State of the Union speech. It's challenging, but I think it's important to listen to state parties and grassroots organizers, for the national parties to think about that, and for the national parties to fund the state parties and these grassroots organizations. I saw a quote from one voter who was a rural voter, and he said, well, I listened to this guy and he was a Democrat and I liked what he said, but that's weird because I'm a Republican. And this was the quote he ended up saying: when there's only one church in town, guess what religion you become? And that really kind of struck me, because, when we just throw our hands up and say we're never going to win rural areas, I think we're really giving up a lot there. So how do we do that? There's evidence that listening to voters and framing issues in their values, not preaching at them, and not just showing up at election time, also focusing on local elections and issues, not just showing up every 2 years or every 4 years. So only 7 House Democrats out of more than 200 represent a district that voted for Trump in 2020. And so those folks also have been trying to, I think, talk to the National Party and others about how to have those conversations in rural areas or with more conservative voters. A little bit more polling that I'll share with you when it comes to so that's about how to expand the electorate for Democrats. But when it comes to the base, recent polling found 28% of Democrats says their party didn't get things done last year because they were infighting or they lacked resolve. So they were mad at their own party for not getting things done. About half blame the Republican Party for blocking their efforts. And only about a fourth says the Democratic Party is really accomplishing its goals. There's also an enthusiasm gap that we're seeing already, with more Republicans than Democrats saying they're certain to vote in November. And this one, I just can't stop looking at. It doesn't matter what happens. Look at that Trump approval line. It didn't change after the election. It didn't change after the attack on the Capitol. Meanwhile, Pence and McConnell, their approval went way down among Republicans, but Trump's has remained pretty steady. And clearly he wants to wield that influence over the party. Okay, I'm just going to talk about a few more things, and then I want to turn it over to Q&A. But a couple items I want to make sure that you're aware of in state politics, which this group probably is. But there is a measure in the state legislature that would require, so I should step back. As you know, in Missouri, we've had initiatives to expand Medicaid, raise the minimum wage, legalize marijuana, clean Missouri, all of these sorts of initiatives, the referendum on right to work, that the voters approved, but the same voters who put conservative politicians in office who oppose these measures, right? So the state legislature says, forget that. They're discussing how they could basically make it harder to get these initiatives on the ballot and to pass them. So this proposal would require that if a ballot did make it if a measure made it to the ballot to amend the Constitution, that would require 2/3 of voter approval instead of 51%. So raising the bar for voter approval, also raising the bar for how to get on the ballot. So instead of getting 8% of voters' signatures from 6 out of 8 congressional districts, it would require signatures from all 8 districts and 10% of voters in all those districts. So if this would be passed by the legislature, it would have to go to the voters for approval. But it seems pretty clear what motivated this. I will share an anecdote. When I was at the state capitol with some colleagues after the 2018 round of initiatives passed, and we had put together these data, and we're meeting with state legislators and saying, hey, look at this. Voters in your district voted for Clean Missouri, they voted to legalize marijuana, medicinal, and they voted to raise the minimum wage. But then they also voted for you, and you oppose all these things. Can you explain that to us? And one very honest legislator, and I will not say who it was, from a Republican district, said, well, voters in my district only care about 2 things. And he said, he said 3 things, guns and babies. And then he paused, and then he said, I guess babies with guns. And how I vote on anything else doesn't matter. So his point there was they're going to elect me based on the culture war issues, on guns and abortion. And these sort of policies and initiatives do not matter for my support among my constituents. And another proposal that's being discussed and Governor Parson supports is allow government agencies to charge fees for the time attorneys spend reviewing records requested by the public. So basically to put shade on the Sunshine Law. So they not only want to make it more costly, but they want to limit the access to different types of records like draft versions of bills. And it redefines what's public business or a public meeting, so limits that. I know in my research, I'm doing research on contributions to St. Louis City and county elections right now. We got that information through Sunshine Request, also who's on boards and commissions. That's how we got this information. And so, again, an attempt to limit that. So I will stop talking now and open it up. I think there might be another candidate who needs to introduce themselves, but otherwise open it up to Q&A.
And you're right. And actually, I'm going to let you take a few seconds here to catch your breath, get a drink if you need one. You've been talking and it's been very interesting and entertaining. But so while you catch your breath and take a little pause, I'm going to introduce Jeffrey Spector, who's running for the Parkway School Board, and let him say a few things. And also for the Q&A, if you have questions, if you just want to put them in the chat, I will read through those and ask our guest speaker tonight and try and group like questions together. So if you do have questions, feel free to start sending those in on the chat box. So Mr. Spector. I think you're muted, Mr. Spector.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Sorry about that. I had it on the wrong mic. Thank you guys for having me. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to come earlier. Parkway had its first meeting with regards to project improvements, and I had talked with Maureen, who thought that was something I let her know something I needed to be a part of. So I apologize for being late to the meeting, but I want to thank you and want to give kind of a little bit about me. I'm running for Parkway Board of Education. I've been a Chesterfield resident my entire life. I'm 37. Other than these 7 years that I was in college and law school, I've been a Chesterfield resident. I graduated from Parkway Central in 2003. My wife and I met my senior year of high school and have been together ever since. I have 2 children in the Parkway district. My mother was a Parkway school teacher for 16 years. So Parkway is near and dear to my heart. It is something that I want to see succeed. It benefits the community, whether you have children in the district or not. We have great bond ratings. We have lower taxes than the areas around us. And we have great property value. moves. So for those of you that, are looking to potentially figure out if you're going to vote for a school board, even though you don't have kids in the district, there are a lot of good reasons to vote in this election from a community member standpoint and from a resident in Parkway. But I do have various websites and Facebook. I don't want to take up too much of your time, as I know you all have been on here for a bit now. But if there are any questions regarding my campaign, regarding why I'm running, obviously there's a lot of divisiveness. School boards are, the tension is at an all-time high. And I just want to make sure that Parkway doesn't go down some of the roads that we've seen in neighboring districts, and want to make sure the success of Parkway going forward. So in the Q&A, if I will still be here for any questions that you may have of me as a candidate, and I'll also include in the chat some my website and Facebook. If you have any questions, you can contact me there as well. I appreciate it.
All right, thank you very much. So I was fascinated by the charts and graphs. I always like all this data and fun stuff. And I know there's always a lag. So do you think any of these population shifts would be dramatically affected by the pandemic and people leaving suburban areas to more urban areas and urban people going a little more rural? Do we think there's going to be any material impact from that?
That's a good question. And you're right about the lag. So it takes some time to measure that. I think anecdotally, we have seen people moving away from some of those urban centers as they don't have to live there to work there anymore. And so, we can see where the hot markets are, the real estate markets, like in Tampa, Florida, and other places where you can live fairly cheaply and have a really nice climate. So that could continue this trend of shifting towards the Sun Belt, I think. I also want to say, hey, Jeffrey, I think I heard you on the Heartland pod, and I really enjoyed the discussion with all three of the candidates running for the school board. I really appreciate that. And I think that school boards are a really important conversation to have right now.
Yeah, there's 2 spots open and 10 candidates on the ballot this year. So it's a lot of candidates, many of which really, I don't understand their reasoning, that nobody has seen or heard from, I would say at least half of the candidates. So it's these types of races are becoming more and more critical.
Yeah, and certainly we've heard talk from some of our current office holders about making them partisan, which makes me cringe, but that's another conversation.
Same here.
I know, and we are doing things here. Do you think there would be any impact because of the current situation in Ukraine? We talked about inflation, and of course, people vote their pocketbook, but on the same time, in history, are you aware of any bias to re-elect incumbents when you're in the middle of conflicts?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. There is this idea in political science of the rally around the flag effect. And certainly a classic example in the United States was after 9/11, when we saw George Bush's ratings go through the roof and a real sense of patriotism and Americans coming together. Generally, this isn't when we're just sort of supportive of a conflict. It's when we're actually in danger or feel threatened. It's the kind of thing that I would have hoped the pandemic would have sparked, some sort of sense of national unity and coming together. Unfortunately, we saw the opposite, being used for divisiveness. We certainly see the rally around the flag effect for Zelensky, who, there's a lot of skepticism about him in Ukraine, and now universal admiration. But I don't know, depending, let's hope this doesn't escalate to the point that we have American troops on the ground by the election. If we did have troops on the ground, that could change the calculus there. I think the president in his State of the Union tried to use the situation in Ukraine as well as other issues to find areas of unity. But I'm not sure that it will have a strong impact. I was thinking today about the fact that both Republicans and Democrats are supportive of cutting off oil from Russia. But then Republicans are also going to say, in the run up to the election, look at the gas prices, this is Biden's fault. So I think it's really challenging as we're trying to navigate this.
the overall population it's sort of the flip side, there has been the migration to urban and suburban areas out of rural areas, and then maybe it's turned around the last 2 years. Is it too early to start thinking about just the overall Missouri population in the governor's election? If you can control the top seat, you can control quite a few things.
Yeah, I would say that Missouri population, we have seen population shifting out of, for example, St. Louis City. But it's not necessarily leaving Missouri, just shifting more to St. Charles County or other neighboring counties. So I don't know in a statewide race, those population shifts are going to make a big difference. I think it's more about voter enthusiasm, voter turnout. It's a real uphill battle, as you all know, for Democrats in a statewide race in Missouri right now. But I'm not sure that population at this point is going to change it. Now, over in the long run, if we can get maybe a more educated electorate, if we can get some institutions, some employers that bring in a more educated and diverse electorate, and if maybe we can build on immigration as well, those I think could all change the political atmosphere in Missouri.
Well, and I forgot to put a key attribute on that. Is as a person who just turned 65, with the aging population, is that anything you're studying in Missouri and what that might affect in these statewide races?
That's a really good question, Michael. I haven't specifically looked at like aging in Missouri. We know that generally we are seeing a trend where like the silent generation and the boomers are at a tipping point with the millennials and Gen Xers, Gen Zs, the younger generation, as far as the overall population in elections. But I'm not sure specific to Missouri what that ratio is looking like.
It's, November's a long ways away, and yet it's not a long ways away. What do you think will be what are you looking at to watch for developments that might really, impact this coming election, whether it's local, state, national, geopolitical?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think, the Republicans have really latched on to making local. So they used to say all politics are local, right? But now it's like all politics are federal. When we're talking about redistricting in Missouri, and we're calling it the Nancy Pelosi map, for example. So I think that they're really making an effort to tie very moderate Democrats in red states to the most liberal Democrats they can at the federal level, and to really grab onto those culture war issues. So when Jeffrey was talking about school boards, we saw in Virginia how the governor really used, I'm going to get rid of critical race theory, which was not being taught in schools, as a rallying cry. We're seeing all sort of legislation like that being proposed in the Missouri state legislature, as well as others. So I think, depending on what the Supreme Court does for a change, culture war and courts could motivate liberals. We could see if there was an erosion of reproductive rights, that maybe there will be a backlash from the left, and that could be an energizing factor. I see that Kathy is also asking in the chat about Republicans frightening voters and telling them things that are not true about Democrats. So what could that counter messaging be? And you specifically mentioned, Kathy, defund the police and open borders. And I think those are two things that President Biden specifically tried to address in his State of the Union. And to Michael's question about like what might those issues be in the midterm elections, I really felt like the president was trying to frame that narrative and say, we are not about defunding the police. We are not about open borders. And so I think that he was trying to preempt and eliminate those arguments. And also, if you look generally among Democratic candidates, that's true, but that's not what people are hearing, right? They are being tied to the most liberal narrative that they can. And like you said, scare tactics. So that counter messaging, I think, really has to happen from an individual candidate. in their district, whether it's their state house district, their congressional district, their local school board election, having those earnest conversations with voters and letting the candidate themselves come through instead of just being painted by the national narrative. One thing that I've been working on, and perhaps if I can get this moving, might be reaching out to some folks in this group, but there are some of us who are trying to establish a Missouri State Debate Commission. There are only 4 states that currently have one. A challenge that we have at UMSL, that they're having now even with the Presidential Debate Commission, is a reticence on, and that's a nice way of putting it, on behalf of Republicans to participate in these discussions and in these forums. And a state debate commission would create a nonpartisan forum with levers through media to try to put pressure on those candidates to have these conversations. I think the more that voters can hear the real positions of real candidates, the better it is for the Democratic Party.
And just a quick announcement, if you may have seen in the chat box, our 2 candidates who did their introductions, John and Deb, are still around. If there are questions for them, you can put them into the chat box as well. Not trying to take anything away from our main speaker, but while we have.
No, please.
You mentioned something, in the map, that there was some reason for optimism. So on the other hand, we heard there's a lot of districts where Democrats aren't running. Is there reason to tell people in a district that doesn't have a candidate that there is hope?
I think that there is hope there, especially in some of these redrawn districts. And I think that there's hope when candidates, now hopefully we're in an era where candidates can be back doing town halls and back canvassing and going to small events and really getting to know the voters in their districts. And I think it is important, even if it seems like a long shot, that we have contested elections, that we're not just throwing up our hands and giving away those seats. That contributes to the feeling, I think, in some of these areas, that the Democrats aren't a party that cares about those voters, particularly rural voters, that they're not even an option. And I think that it's important that, one party doesn't just write off an entire group of voters.
Since I already said I'm one of the old guys, Schoolhouse Rock, it seemed like the Constitution, there was supposed to be 3 legs of government, so there'd always be checks and balances.
Right.
And right now it seems like we've gone to 2 parties. I mean, you don't talk about a judge without saying, was he a Republican or a Democratic nominee? Is that eroding it? Do you think that's eroding anything in our form of government and perception of government, trust of government?
I absolutely do. And I think it's very unfortunate. I mean, you can look at public opinion polling, which has its ups and downs depending on, your political orientation and the decision a court might make, but increasingly overall distrust of the courts. And that's how courts get their legitimacy. That's how our government gets its legitimacy. I think that it's very explicit from, retiring Justice Breyer and from also Chief Justice Roberts, that this is not the perception of the court that they want. And they don't want it to be seen as partisan. We've had judges come out and say, I'm not a Trump judge. I'm not an Obama judge. I am just a judge. I'm interested to see how the confirmation hearings go for our latest nominee. Obviously, there's already some rhetoric out there that is inconsistent with the past. So saying that you can't vote for somebody because they're an affirmative action hire, when in the past we've certainly had Ronald Reagan say he's going to nominate a woman, Trump say he's going to nominate a woman. So the difference here is that they're saying they're going to nominate a Black woman. Yes, I do find that troubling.
A lot of things get done on social media, and a large portion of the population follows things on social media. But I think about my mother and aunts, uncles, and people like that who don't follow on social media. How do candidates reach that part of the voting population, especially if they're older and likely to be very active.
Yeah, and you are certainly right. Yeah, we know that older populations vote at higher rates, contribute to campaigns, are involved at higher rates, and maybe some of the candidates like John and Deb might have ideas about how they've reached older voters. But I do think it's a challenge. I guess in more traditional ways is how you reach older voters, including going to those town halls, going to those small events, participating in local debates, that might be televised on local TV. I think that those are some of the ways that you can reach older voters. I will say, again, part of the upside is that older voters do tend to participate at higher rates. I tend to, especially in my profession, think a lot about how to reach and energize the younger voters. How do we reach them? They're on social media, but that doesn't matter. That doesn't get them out to the polls because they're posting or arguing online. That's not the same as getting out and voting or canvassing and volunteering. And so I also think a lot about how to reach those voters.
This one's probably going to come from left field, but do you ever think there's a possibility that Election Day will become a federal holiday so everybody can hopefully
I hope
more
so.
people can vote?
I hope so. I do study elections and election reform, and that is popular and hopefully effective reform. There are other, and of course, in some of the national legislation that would be included, but that's not going to be passed without the filibuster being reformed. But I think there's a lot that states like Missouri could do. I mean, we're particularly bad in Missouri with not having no excuse absentee voting, with not having same-day voter registration, which same-day voter registration has been shown to help improve voter turnout among Black and Latino voters, young voters. So I think there's so many voting reforms that in a time we're seeing this real attack on our democracy. One of the things that's so troubling to me is the high number of Americans, particularly Republicans, who still believe that the election was stolen, don't believe in the legitimacy of our elections, that the ire that we're seeing turn on bureaucrats who dedicate their life to running free and fair elections and the threats that they're receiving, and some of the state laws that are being enacted to make it more difficult to vote, that ultimately disenfranchise certain voters and that put partisan actors in charge of elections. So all of those things are particularly troubling to me when we think about the state of our democracy. That wasn't a very optimistic note, was it?
We want honest feedback, honest opinion. Sometimes it takes serious times and events to get people motivated. They can become complacent when all is good. As you talked about earlier, some of the issues, reproductive rights and things, might energize people that took things for granted. I don't see.
Mike, Norm has his hand up.
Oh, sorry. Thanks, Brian. Norm?
Okay, I'm here and unmuted. I'd like to ask Dr. Mannion, what percentage of Missouri voters consider themselves to be independent? And in particular, what about our part of the state, St. Louis County? And are there issues that have been identified as those that would appeal to independent voters that might make them say, maybe I think the Democrats deserve a look? I'm thinking of things like, does the average voter even know how disproportionately Democrats are represented in both the House and the Senate? Are they aware of such egregious thinking as a 7-to-1 map? That's the height of arrogance. And also the proposals regarding the making it harder to use the initiative, for example. So are there ways that we can reach independents out of just saying, well, people tend to vote, well, when you say independent, they're going to split evenly, half of the Democrats and half of the Republicans. Is that really the case? Are they reachable? How do we reach them?
Those are really good questions, Norm. And I think this is the question, that we've been having the last several election cycles. Are there true independents? And I would say political science research tends to say most people lean Republican or lean Democrat, even if they say they're independent. Increasingly, people across the country are calling themselves independents rather than identifying as a political party. The most recent political affiliation data that I've seen on Missourians is about, it's actually more about ideology, with 68% saying they're conservative, 32% saying moderate, and I'm sorry, of Republicans, sorry, they're saying that, here, I'll just show you the chart. Actually, why am I trying to describe it to you when I could show it to you? So let me pull this up. So this is a little bit older data from 2014, and we know Missouri consistently is growing more conservative, more Republican leaning. Like where I grew up in Jefferson County, and my dad worked for Chrysler and was a union guy, and all of those, you know, non-college educated white men that he worked with, union men, were Democrats because of the union. And now I know some of them. My dad passed away, but I know some of those guys still, and a lot of them, you know, are now Trump supporters and have moved that way. A lot of it has to do with economic issues, feeling that economic insecurity, but also feeling like they've been left behind and someone is standing up for them. After the 2016 election, I read a lot of books like Politics of Resentment, Strangers in Their Own Land, Hillbilly Elegy, trying to understand what drove this shift, particularly among rural white voters, towards Trump. And the narrative by all these researchers tended to be, and the voters affirmed that when they talked to them, was we feel left behind. We feel the things that we used to be that were valuable as, you know, white, Christian, married, straight, you know, whatever it was, a union person, that they're no longer valued and we feel left behind. And it's hard for me to see how someone like Trump, who's a billionaire from New York and all this, made them feel included, but he did. So I think that's part of connecting with those voters that you're talking about, some of those disaffected voters. So this is, it's hard because Missourians, this is the latest data that I saw from Pew. I could look and try to find something more current and send it to Maureen, but this is among Republican leaning who said they're conservative, but this doesn't really tell us, it shows us more that more people say they're conservative, doesn't really show us the party. So that's not exactly what you're looking for. So I can try to find that for you, but I think overall, certainly we can see over time, Missouri used to be a bellwether state until 2008. We were voting for the winning presidential candidate, whether it was George Bush or Bill Clinton. But in 2008, the country voted for Obama, and we were the closest in the nation, but did not vote for Obama. We voted McCain, and then we just continually got redder and redder. And I think, you know, for Democrats, that is the question that you're trying to figure out. Why is that? And what can you do to reconnect with those voters? So like I said, I think a lot about the people that I grew up with in the church I went to in Eureka, and the guys who worked at the Fenton Chrysler plant that is no longer there, and how they do feel disaffected and how they feel left behind, and how can the Democratic Party, who is trying to provide Medicaid expansion and who is trying to increase the minimum wage, how can they connect those policies rather than just emotions?
Thank you. We have another raised hand now that I've learned how to spot that easier. Dennis, you have your hand raised if you want to introduce yourself and ask your question.
I was trying to get myself so you could see me too, but it won't do it. I can't start my video, so you have to do without. I won't do it. Populism. Both Kuntz and Hawley have different versions of populism, and certainly in the case of Hawley, it contributed to his success with his election. Kuntz, at least from a fundraising, although that money is a lot of it's coming from out of state. But I guess, how does populism perhaps transcend political party affiliation and therefore create some degree of success?
That's a great question. Oh, there, now I see you, Dennis.
Yeah, I saw I could do it, so I figured, okay, let me show who's talking.
Yeah, that is a really good question.
So we don't pull up the screen here.
And so that I agree with you about Coons and Hawley, and I would even take it so far as Sanders and Trump, two people to me that are very different. But we saw Sanders voters switching over to Trump after the primary, and it is I think that populist bent. And it's a way, I think, of a lot of those disaffected voters I was talking about, but also young voters, feeling like somebody's fighting for them. And almost like an anti-establishment bent too. You know, we're against big corporations, we're against big governments. You know, Sanders runs as an independent, except for when he runs for president. And so I do see that, and I certainly think that Coons is trying to capitalize on that. I think he's also been trying to discredit Hawley's populist credentials, saying, what are you talking about? His dad was a banker, he went to private school, you know, he's not a man of the people. But I do think that is an opportunity for that crossover vote in Missouri. And I don't think it's a bad strategy. And like you said, it's working for the fundraising. I think the military background helps. You know, I see like a little Jason Kander, maybe inspiration there too.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So populism can transcend the political parties, is what you're suggesting. Okay.
I am suggesting that, yes. And I think that it's really running on an economic platform, and then also sort of an emotional appeal to like that anti-establishment, anti-corporation, anti-big government.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, I see another raised hand, Mr. Keeney, if you want to ask your question.
Yeah, really quick. I had to change clothes because
I was just going to compliment you on your shirt.
I had to get the girls ready for bed, so I was changing diaper and stuff. Real quick question though, you know, I'm running for office again, and we look at the polling that comes out, and we talk about these things. How do we reach out to voters? How do we connect with the vote? What are the issues we connect with the voters about? And regarding, you know, some of the stuff that you presented, and I've seen some other polls like this very recently, the economy, their income, and then healthcare, and it kind of, you know, trickles down. But in my area, we're out in Eureka, and so if we talk about sort of really West St. Louis County, I think a lot of folks from West St. Louis County can tell you that we've seen so much energy over the anti-vax, CRT, all this stuff. And it seems to be a really significant concern. It's putting people in the Board of Education elections, not only in Rockwood, but over, I know in St. Charles County and some of the other areas, are off the chain with people just acting crazy over these issues of the book bans and the anti-CRT, whatever. Do you see a reflection? Number one, do you see a reflection in some polling, some things you've seen in that regard? And number two, you know, these are culture wars. Do you have any insights as to, you know, what we might do to counteract some of the stuff that we're doing, other than, you know, tell me what CRT is when they ask you, but you know, you don't always get that opportunity.
Yeah, those are great points, John. And you're right that certainly the Republican Party has been very successful in those. I think a lot of the fear and anxiety and genuine concern that parents had during the pandemic about their kids' education, about their emotional well-being, about being able to homeschool your kids and make sure that they know anything and live your life. All of these things bubbled up concerns, and they opened a door to some of these networks to really come in and feed off of that. Even though we don't have mask requirements, we don't have vaccine requirements, and we're not teaching critical race theory, we see that those topics still resonate, and they're really sparking emotion from parents, and parents who were independents or parents who were Democrats are also, you know, being swept up in this. And I think it's very challenging to counter emotion with facts. I like to think that there's a lot of time between now and November. And so if parents can get through this semester and their kids are going to school and they're not wearing masks and, you know, these things, maybe that will tamp down some of that fervor, but it's there. And like you said, the Rockwood school board meetings, we're seeing it, not just Rockwood, all around. And, it's being used in governor's races and by our Senate candidates. If you watch any of the CPAC speeches that were given by Josh Hawley or, Eric Schmidt, that they focus on these issues too. So how do we combat them? I think that is the question. And I wish I had a good answer for you. I think affirming rather than trying to just confront critical race theory is not taught in K through 12 schools, but instead recognizing that that's people saying, we are uncomfortable with conversations about race and we don't want to feel blamed for anything. So sort of that same narrative that I was telling you I was reading about after the 2016 election. So how can we frame things in people's values in a way that they can be heard? So maybe instead of arguing about critical race theory in a way, although we do need to take a stand on that, maybe talking about funding for schools or equity in a way that can be received by a lot of people, accommodations for students with disabilities, problems with charter schools, the data on how many charter schools fail. So I think while it's important to keep correcting false narratives, sometimes it's hard to win battles through that and to change hearts and minds. So sometimes changing the narrative and having a different conversation. What is well-being in the classroom? It's not just masking. It's lots of other things. It's having qualified teachers and a teacher shortage, which means funding higher education, having quality K through 12 schools, about giving healthcare through Medicaid expansion. So I think that maybe having some of those other conversations could help reframe the narrative as well.
All right. I don't see any more raised hands. It's 8:26. Sorry, we're scheduled to go to 8:30. It's been a very interesting and fast-paced evening. Special thanks to our speaker tonight, Dr. Anita Mannion. It's been fun, very entertaining, very educational. Hopefully, we've motivated some of our audience here tonight. And thanks to Deb Lavender and John Keeney and Jeffrey Spector for running for their offices this year and introducing themselves to us. We will continue to support you in any way we can in your races. It's an election year. It's going to be very important to stay involved, stay active. As I mentioned earlier, we're trying to find a way to do hybrid meetings. We think we can hopefully have more energy when we meet in person and get to talk and socialize again. That's all very important to all that. But as we are working through all that, continue to follow us on Facebook and talk to your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers. Encourage them either to be active in the Democrats or possibly run if you think they'd be a good candidate in one of those districts that's open. It's going to take all of us this year. It's a little bit of an uphill climb, but as we heard tonight, it's not necessarily a futile cause. There is reasons for optimism and hope, and if we work hard, hopefully we can bring it home. So with that, I will wrap it up. Again, thank you to all of our speakers and guests tonight. I look forward to our next meeting. And as I said, be safe out there, and you can continue to follow us on Facebook. Thanks and have a good night.
It's good talking to you.
Thank you.
Night.
Bye.